November 24, 1971, began like any other gray morning in Portland, Oregon. The sky hung low, swollen with clouds that pressed against the city in a heavy, damp embrace. At gate C-12, passengers shuffled forward in slow, hesitant lines, carrying the quiet weight of their routines. Amid the murmurs and clinking suitcases, one man moved with a precision that drew no attention. His suit was black, tailored perfectly to his frame, pressed and impeccable. His shoes shone faintly under the fluorescent airport lights. He carried a simple black briefcase, the kind most travelers would dismiss as ordinary, but in his grip, it seemed like an extension of his very being. No one knew his name, no one guessed his intentions. To the casual observer, he was calm, collected, almost painfully ordinary. But within him, a meticulous mind worked with relentless precision. Every step he took, every glance he cast, was calculated, planned weeks, perhaps months in advance. The briefcase was heavy, but he bore it with ease, the weight balanced by focus. Memories flickered behind his eyes, childhood betrayals, lost opportunities, the sting of injustice, and the quiet hum of unresolved anger. This was not a man who committed random acts of crime. He was a man driven by a code known only to himself. He passed through the metal detector with a measured patience, hands empty except for the briefcase, which he set gently on the conveyor belt. The TSA officer glanced at him briefly, making a note of his demeanor. Composed, polite, unremarkable. Perfect camouflage. Cooper met the officer's gaze with a faint nod, then turned, blending seamlessly into the throng of passengers. Inside the boarding area, he noticed her first, the flight attendant. Young, meticulous, dressed in the crisp uniform of Northwest Orient Airlines. Her smile was polite, rehearsed, a small line of tension visible beneath the surface. To him, she was a variable, a piece in a puzzle he intended to control. He calculated how her presence might shift the dynamics aboard the aircraft. He boarded Flight 305, moving past families, businessmen, and silent observers, each absorbed in the small cocoon of their own concerns. The hum of engines and the faint scent of coffee filled the cabin. He chose a seat near the rear, where he could observe without being observed, where escape or control could be exercised without interference. His eyes, dark and calm, scanned the passengers, noting their habits, their nervous tics, their unspoken vulnerabilities. The flight crew, unaware of the storm that would soon arrive, went about their routines with practiced ease. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, cheerful, standard. Cooper adjusted his briefcase on the floor, fingers brushing the handle as if testing its readiness. There was no rush, no panic, only quiet deliberation. He reflected briefly on the life he had led, the decisions that had brought him to this point. He was not reckless, he was deliberate. Every step he took, every glance, every small act, had been rehearsed in the silent theater of his mind. For the passengers around him, he was invisible. For the crew, he was courteous. For himself, he was ready. The man in black, composed and unreadable, waited for the perfect moment, the precise instant when patience, planning, and audacity would converge. Outside, the clouds pressed down on the runway, gray and heavy, as if the world itself held its breath. And in that quiet tension, the stage was set. Soon, the calm would fracture. Soon, the ordinary would collide with the extraordinary. But for now, he remained silent, calculating, a shadow among the living, carrying a secret that would change the course of the flight, and the lives aboard it, forever. The hum of Flight 305's engines became a low, insistent pulse, vibrating through the cabin like a warning. Cooper sat upright, briefcase resting lightly at his feet, eyes calm yet piercing, as if he could read the very souls of those around him. The atmosphere shifted imperceptibly at first, a tremor of unease that only the flight crew noticed. The passengers remained absorbed in their own worlds, unaware that the ordinary flight they had boarded was about to fracture under the weight of fear. Cooper stood slowly, his movements deliberate, measured. The flight attendant near him stiffened, instinctively raising an eyebrow, unsure whether to smile or panic. Her hands clutched the intercom microphone like a lifeline. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cooper began, voice steady, almost conversational, "I'd like your attention for a few moments." He paused, scanning the cabin with a faint, unreadable smile. "This is not a threat to the passengers if my conditions are met, but compliance is essential." The attendant's hand trembled as she spoke into the intercom, her voice betraying the tiniest edge of panic. "Sir, what do you mean?" "I need two things," Cooper said calmly, as if discussing the weather. $200,000 in cash, unmarked. Bills, and 4 parachutes. No tricks, no delays. If you cooperate fully, no one will be harmed. The crew exchanged quick, silent glances. Their fear was tangible, a living thing crawling along their spines. The stewardess's fingers shook around the microphone. The pilot's knuckles whitened as he gripped the yoke, eyes darting nervously toward the cabin. Each heartbeat seemed amplified, reverberating against the steel hull. Cooper remained an island of composure. He shifted his weight slightly, placing one hand on the briefcase, brushing the handle as though it anchored him to certainty. He spoke not to intimidate, but to control, and in that subtle control, the psychological manipulation was complete. The crew felt themselves balancing on the edge of his calm, their own panic mirrored and magnified by his perfect stillness. The money, Cooper continued, his tone almost conversational, will be delivered at the Seattle-Tacoma airport. 4 parachutes will be provided at the same time. Delay or resistance, and consequences will be severe. His eyes scanned the cabin, briefly meeting those of a young flight attendant. For a moment, a flash of empathy crossed his features, just enough to confuse her fear with a hint of understanding. In the cockpit, the pilot whispered into the radio, tension in every syllable. We have a situation. He's demanding ransom and parachutes." The voice trembled, betraying the calm professionalism expected in moments of crisis. Back in the cabin, murmurs of disbelief rippled through the passengers. Some sensed danger, others ignored it, too absorbed in disbelief to respond. Cooper, ever aware, used the silence as a tool. He let his gaze linger, letting the tension settle like smoke over everyone in his path. "Stay calm," he said softly, almost kindly to the crew nearest him. "Follow instructions. Everyone will survive. Panic only complicates matters." Minutes stretched into hours, though in reality only moments had passed. Each tick of the clock was a measured note in Cooper's silent orchestration. The crew's fear deepened, but so did their fascination, an almost involuntary acknowledgement of his unshakable control. Their minds raced, calculating escape, compliance, survival, but all under the shadow of his cool, calculating demeanor. By the time the plane began its descent toward Seattle, the crew had learned, in a painful and involuntary way, the terrifying weight of obedience under his control. Cooper had revealed his plan, and the stage was set. The passengers were unwitting participants in a psychological duel between fear and calculation, and no one could predict which would prevail. Outside, clouds pressed against the fuselage, gray and heavy, as if the sky itself was aware of the tension within. Inside, Cooper returned to his seat, hands folded neatly on the briefcase, calm, collected, waiting. The flight was no longer just a journey from Portland to Seattle. It had become a stage for manipulation, strategy, and fear, a flight whose consequences would extend far beyond the cabin walls. The cabin of Flight 305 was heavy with tension, a silent current that ran beneath the hum of engines and the occasional click of seatbelts. Passengers sat unaware of the full gravity of the situation, their minds still caught between disbelief and the distant, ill-defined fear that something was terribly wrong. Cooper, seated near the rear, watched quietly, his dark eyes moving from face to face, calculating, measuring, cataloging. Each glance was deliberate, each observation a silent note in the symphony of control he conducted with unnerving precision. He noticed the small, trembling hands of a young flight attendant as she attempted to distribute beverages. Her composure was cracking under the weight of unspoken terror. Cooper leaned forward slightly, not menacingly but with a subtle reassurance. "It's all right, just follow instructions and no one will be harmed." His voice, calm and measured, carried through the cabin. There was empathy there, a faint acknowledgement of human vulnerability, but it was strategically deployed, a tool to maintain control. The passengers' internal worlds were far from calm. A man near the window gripped his armrest so tightly his knuckles whitened, thinking about a recent betrayal he had endured at work, a lie that had cost him a promotion he had counted on. A mother tried to calm her son, whispering that everything was fine, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her own fear. And then there was Thomas, a nervous man in a gray overcoat, pale and shifting in his seat, eyes darting nervously toward the aisle. He had secrets, dark, unspoken memories of an accident he had caused years ago, a guilt he carried like a hidden weight. Cooper noticed him almost immediately, recognizing the subtle rhythm of anxiety and avoidance, yet Thomas remained blissfully unaware that someone had marked him in silence. Cooper's calmness contrasted sharply with the crew's visible anxiety. The flight attendant nearest him had begun to sweat, swallowing hard as she attempted to mask her fear. Cooper's subtle empathy had an unexpected effect. It amplified her sense of obligation, of responsibility, to follow his instructions without hesitation. He was no brute. He was precise, calculating, understanding the fragility of human nerves, and bending them toward his design.
"Sir, can you tell me what you want?" the stewardess asked, voice low, almost a whisper. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone. Cooper's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "Compliance," he said simply. "Do as I ask. There is no reason for fear if you cooperate fully." The psychological tension deepened. Narration revealed Cooper's own thought processes, calculations, contingencies, the mental rehearsal of every possible response. He was aware of every flicker of eye contact, every nervous twitch, every small movement that might indicate resistance. His mind was a chessboard, each passenger, each crew member, a piece to be anticipated, and when necessary, nudged into position. Outside, gray clouds blurred the horizon, the landscape below obscured as the plane cut through the cold November air. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, a compressed stage for fear and control. Every shuffle of feet, every muffled sigh, every glance at the overhead compartments amplified the intensity of the moment. Cooper's calmness anchored the chaos, but beneath the surface, a silent storm of possibilities brewed. What if a passenger acted impulsively? What if the crew faltered? What if chance intervened? Thomas shifted in his seat again, eyes wide, sweat forming at his hairline. He tried to appear casual, but his mind raced through memories he wished could be erased. Cooper's gaze flicked to him briefly, recognizing instinctively the vulnerable, guilt-ridden mind. A small smirk crossed Cooper's face. Some people could be manipulated with nothing more than observation and subtle intimidation. Thomas was already halfway under his invisible control. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, Cooper returned his attention to the briefcase at his feet. The contents were more than a tool. They were the key to everything, the embodiment of control and leverage. The passengers remained mostly unaware, yet their fear, subtle and deep, filled the cabin with tension. Cooper's plan was unfolding exactly as intended. The flight continued towards Seattle, each minute stretching taut with anticipation. Outside, the clouds remained gray, indifferent to human fear. Inside, passengers were trapped in a suspended world, hostages of circumstance, psychology, and the man in black. Cooper's calm dominance contrasted sharply with the rising panic of others, setting the stage for the next act, the negotiation, the descent, the moment when the ordinary world would collide with the extraordinary. The plane's descent toward Seattle-Tacoma Airport began with a subtle shift in the cabin, a slight drop in altitude, the engines humming lower, the hum of anticipation vibrating through the fuselage. Cooper remained calm, hands resting lightly on the briefcase at his feet, his eyes scanning the cabin once more. Each passenger was a variable, each crew member a piece in a carefully orchestrated plan. His mind measured risk with meticulous precision. Outside, the gray November sky pressed against the aircraft, a dull mirror to the tension inside. On the ground, the world braced itself for him. Federal agents moved with quiet urgency, their steps measured, radios crackling with restrained anxiety. Officers arranged positions near the tarmac, every movement calculated to anticipate the demands of a man who was invisible to the world, but fully visible to them in imagination. The exchange, the meeting of control and chaos, was imminent, yet no one could predict how he would act. Cooper, aboard the plane, seemed to inhabit a parallel world, calm, collected, aware of every heartbeat around him, and yet haunted by the echoes of his own past. Memories flickered behind his eyes. Childhood betrayals, the sting of those who had underestimated him, the relentless weight of failure that had never quite left him. Each calculation he made now, the amount of money requested, the specific number of parachutes, the timing of the landing, was influenced not just by logic, but by a deep-seated need to assert control over a world that had for too long left him powerless. He was meticulous, deliberate, and in that precision lay both his genius and his danger. The flight attendant closest to him swallowed hard, voice barely above a whisper as she attempted to communicate with the cockpit. "Sir, are you certain this is what you want?" Cooper's gaze met hers, calm and steady. "I am certain," he replied softly. "Follow instructions carefully. Everyone will remain unharmed. Compliance ensures safety." There was no threat in his tone, yet the weight.
Unspoken consequences hung in the air. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot communicated in clipped, tense sentences over the radio. "We're preparing the ground crew for the demands, ransom and parachutes, as instructed," the pilot said, glancing nervously toward the cabin. Cooper's presence, though physically contained, seemed to extend into the minds of those who observed him. His calm, calculating demeanor unsettled them more than any overt threat could. From his seat, Cooper considered the agents below, their movements deliberate but betraying subtle anxiety. He noted their coordination, the distance they maintained, the radios they clutched as though mere touch might summon control. A faint smirk crossed his lips. Predictability, fear, and the instinct to preserve life, all were tools he wielded without hesitation. He reflected briefly on his own past, small betrayals that had scarred him, opportunities denied, and a world that had often misunderstood him. That trauma was not an excuse, but a lens through which he viewed the impossible with clarity. He could act decisively because he had no illusions about human weakness.
He understood the lengths people would go to when confronted with fear. The descent continued, engines humming low, passengers silent, the hum of anticipation thick in the cabin. Cooper's hands brushed the handle of the briefcase again, testing its readiness. Outside, the tarmac of Seattle-Tacoma grew larger, lights blinking through the gray drizzle like distant stars. Every calculation was precise. Every movement had been rehearsed in his mind countless times. Dialogue crackled again through the intercom, the stewardess attempting to maintain composure. "Sir, they're ready to meet your demands." Cooper's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "Good. Prepare everything. Timing is critical. We proceed exactly as planned." As the plane drew closer to the runway, the passengers remained oblivious to the complexity unfolding around them. Cooper's calm dominance contrasted sharply with the orchestrated panic of those below. He had revealed just enough of his intentions to ensure compliance, yet withheld everything else, keeping the world on edge, bound by anticipation and fear. The descent was no longer merely a technical procedure. It had become a stage for control, a theater of psychological tension where every actor, the crew, the passengers, the agents, played a part in his invisible design. Cooper's mind was already ahead, calculating the next move, preparing for the exchange, for the final act where fear, precision, and opportunity would converge in a single orchestrated moment. The tarmac stretched beneath Flight 305, gray and slick with November drizzle, lights reflecting off the wet pavement like scattered jewels. Cooper's eyes remained steady, unblinking, as the black briefcase at his feet seemed almost to hum with possibility. Outside, the world moved with urgent precision. Federal agents in dark overcoats coordinated quietly, their radios alive with static and whispered instructions. Every movement was calculated to anticipate his demands, yet the man in black remained several steps ahead, a shadow in a world trying desperately to pin him down. The delivery truck pulled alongside the rear stairs, sliding open to reveal the cash and the 4 parachutes, crisp and tightly folded, as if they had been prepared for this moment alone. Cooper observed in silence, letting the crew and agents breathe through their tension. His gaze flicked briefly toward the passengers, each face a mix of relief, confusion, and lingering fear. They had survived, yes, but at the cost of witnessing a calm, calculating man bend circumstances to his will. The stewardess stepped forward hesitantly, hands trembling as she handed the money and parachutes over to Cooper. It's all here," she whispered. Her voice wavered between relief and disbelief. Cooper's eyes softened, just enough to convey an acknowledgement without pity. "Good. You have done exactly as instructed. No harm will come to you now," he said, calm, controlled, almost gentle. But beneath the words, the invisible weight of control still pressed heavily on the cabin. One by one, Cooper released the passengers. Mothers gathered their children, businessmen clutched briefcases, and the occasional glance toward him betrayed a subtle recognition of the quiet power he wielded. Fear and compliance had come at a price, the realization that life could be manipulated with nothing more than observation, calculation, and timing. The crew exhaled as they assisted the passengers down the stairs. Some offered fleeting thanks, others avoided his eyes entirely, uncomfortable with the combination of relief and lingering unease. Cooper's mind, however, never strayed. He noted the subtle betrayals that had surfaced in tiny moments, the flight attendant who had hesitated, the pilot whose fingers had trembled, the silent glance of a passenger who considered
alerting someone to him. All inconsequential individually, but together they were a tapestry of human vulnerability he had catalogued for his own understanding. Each hesitation, each unspoken thought was observed and stored, reinforcing the quiet mastery he held over circumstance. Only a handful remained: Cooper, the stewardess closest to him, the pilot, and a federal agent who had insisted on boarding last minute. The agent's eyes were sharp, intense, and haunted by the obsessive drive that had defined him for months. He had been tracking Cooper's movements, theorizing, analyzing every detail from the moment the hijacker's name, or lack thereof, had entered the news. Every instinct in his body screamed that he was dealing with someone extraordinary, someone who existed in a mental landscape different from ordinary men. Cooper's gaze briefly met the agent's. It was a quiet exchange, almost imperceptible. The agent's jaw tightened. He recognized the calm in Cooper's eyes, the kind of detachment that came not from lack of fear, but from mastery over it. For a moment, their minds brushed like colliding currents beneath the surface of observation. The agent would carry this image with him forever, the man in black, smiling faintly, a living paradox of menace and control. The rear stairs of the plane were lowered completely. Passengers filed down in careful, orderly lines, their movements choreographed by necessity, compliance, and fear. The rain tapped against the fuselage, creating a rhythmic drumbeat that underscored the quiet tension. Outside,
Agents whispered final instructions to the ground crew, yet every action was measured, calculated, insufficient to anticipate what would come next. Cooper's mind was already elsewhere, calculating, preparing, reading the next set of probabilities like an invisible chessboard. When the last passenger descended, Cooper remained seated, briefcase in hand, hands steady. The stewardess lingered, unsure, her fear and relief battling for dominance. Cooper's lips curled into a faint, imperceptible smile. "You've done well," he murmured. Then, as the agent and the remaining crew watched, he rose, adjusting the briefcase with a precise touch, the faint hum of anticipation almost audible. The stage was set for the next act, the flight that would take him into darkness and into legend.
The roar of the engines filled the cabin, a constant, unyielding presence that seemed to echo the tension within. Flight 305 climbed steadily above the misty contours of the Pacific Northwest, the coastline blurred beneath a gray expanse of clouds. Outside, rain smeared the windows in irregular streaks, each droplet reflecting the pale light of a waning November afternoon. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, heavy with anticipation. Cooper sat with a poised stillness, hands resting lightly on the briefcase at his feet, eyes scanning the instruments and the subtle movements of the remaining crew. The stewardess nearest him shifted uneasily, trying to maintain composure, aware of the silent scrutiny he held over her every motion. "Sir, you're calm, even now," she said, voice barely audible above the drone of the engines. There was a tremor in her tone, part fear, part curiosity. Cooper's gaze met hers, steady and unblinking, a quiet assertion of control. "Calmness is essential," he replied softly. "Panic accomplishes nothing. Focus, and we all remain safe." His words were not threats, but subtle manipulation, weaving reassurance and authority in a delicate, unnerving balance. High above the rugged, forested landscape, Cooper's mind wandered into darker, quieter corners. Freedom was near, tangible in the air around him, yet his desire for it was tempered by the weight of his past. Memories of betrayal and missed opportunities gnawed at him, a persistent undercurrent beneath the surface of his calm exterior. Childhood grievances, fleeting relationships marked by deception, the sting of authority figures who had once humiliated or dismissed him, all had shaped the meticulous, calculating man in the black suit. Each step of his plan was a means to reclaim control, to assert mastery over the world that had so often left him powerless. The stewardess exhaled, almost unconsciously, and shifted a stack of service items. Cooper's eyes followed her movements, noting the subtle tension in her posture. "Every motion counts," he murmured, a faint smile brushing his lips. "Awareness is as important as action." The comment was innocuous in phrasing, yet it subtly heightened her anxiety, reinforcing his quiet psychological dominance. She nodded, swallowing hard, as if acknowledging both the instruction and the invisible boundary he had drawn around their interaction. Below, the Pacific Northwest stretched out in shadowed contours, mountains obscured by fog, rivers shining like silver ribbons beneath the thick gray clouds. The plane moved through the storm with steady precision, though the weather made each second feel longer, each gust of wind her reminder of the precariousness of the moment. The crew's nervous glances toward the instruments and to Cooper were a silent testimony to the tension that hovered over every inch of the aircraft. Cooper's thoughts shifted to the act that would define the night, the leap into darkness that awaited him. The exhilaration of freedom was matched by the gnawing uncertainty. Would the plan succeed, or would fate intervene? Every detail had been calculated, yet he knew that chance could not be fully contained, that the margins of error were as thin as the taut metal beneath his fingertips. Still, he remained composed, poised between anticipation and the quiet weight of responsibility for the lives still aboard. Time moved differently at altitude. Every moment stretched taut, each second filled with expectation. The stewardess shifted again, whispering, Do you ever fear?" Cooper's gaze lingered on hers, faint amusement and seriousness intermingled. "Fear is a choice," he replied softly. "It controls only those who surrender to it. We act because necessity dictates, not because emotion compels." The words, calm yet penetrating, reinforced the subtle psychological tension, leaving her simultaneously reassured and unsettled. Outside, gray clouds churned like a restless sea. The plane cut through mist and rain,
a silent vessel carrying calculated terror across the darkened skies. Inside, Cooper's internal conflict, freedom versus past, desire versus caution, playing out as quietly and as powerfully as the storm around them. The stewardess glanced at him once more, aware of the invisible boundaries, aware of the unspoken calculations guiding every second of their flight. The descent toward uncertainty had begun, the flight carrying them into an unknown future. The engines hummed steadily, the briefcase at his feet a silent symbol of control, and Cooper remained poised, calm and resolute. Outside, the night deepened, the world beneath obscured by clouds, as if the Pacific Northwest itself held its breath. Within the cabin, tension, fear, and anticipation intertwined, setting the stage for the leap that would transform the ordinary into legend. The rear door of Flight 305 swung open, groaning against the force of wind and altitude, revealing a void of black sky streaked with rain and cloud. The roar
of the engines became a deafening roar in the confined space, mixing with the sharp whine of adrenaline that clawed through the remaining crew. Cooper stood at the threshold, briefcase in hand, his dark eyes scanning the stormy night. Calm, calculated, untouchable. The world beneath him was a blur of gray and black, the ground lost in a veil of mist, rain, and shadow. The stewardess nearest him let out a shaky gasp, gripping the railing, her knuckles white. She could barely process the scene unfolding in front of her. The pilot leaned forward, hand on the yoke, jaw tight, watching, paralyzed between instinct and obedience. Every muscle in his body screamed warning, but Cooper's silence and unwavering composure held them frozen, hostage not to weapons, but to certainty and fear. Without hesitation, Cooper adjusted the briefcase strap, weighing the bundles of cash against the cold wind pressing into the cabin. Memories surfaced briefly, unbidden. The sting of betrayal from business partners who had swindled him, the endless nights of counting debts he could never repay, the humiliation of doors closed when opportunity had once glimmered in reach. Each memory lent weight to his determination, each misstep of the past pushing him toward the freedom he now grasped with both hands. He stepped forward, and the gusting wind tugged at his coat, as if the storm itself sought to claim him. The cabin erupted in involuntary sounds, a shriek from the stewardess, a gasp from the pilot, the scraping of metal against the fuselage. Cooper's focus never wavered. He leaned slightly, feeling the pressure of altitude, the pull of gravity, the tenuousness of life balanced in a single, decisive moment. Then he leapt. The plane seemed to exhale, the door yawning wide, exposing the storm as if inviting him into a world of uncertainty. Cooper tumbled into darkness, the briefcase clutched tightly against his chest. Rain lashed against his face, wind whipped his body, and the cold gnawed at exposed skin. He felt every ounce of fear, every surge of adrenaline, but beneath it lay an unshakable clarity, control, planning, and resolve. Inside the cabin, the stewardess shrieked, her voice breaking against the roar of wind. "Oh my God!" The pilot's eyes widened, hands gripping the controls, heart hammering in disbelief. The plane felt empty with him, a hollow shell of metal and tension suspended in the night sky. Fear, awe, and disbelief mingled in every gasping breath, the crew helpless witnesses to the man in black as he descended into the unknown. Cooper's mind, however, was singularly focused. Every calculation had been rehearsed: the altitude, the speed of the plane, the weight of the briefcase, the direction of the wind. Yet even perfect preparation could not erase uncertainty. He was suspended between mastery and chance, between the man he had been and the man he sought to become in this leap. Memories of betrayal surged again, friends who had vanished with his savings, lenders who had mocked his desperation, doors slammed shut by authority and circumstance. Each recollection sharpened his resolve. Each risk embraced carried the promise of freedom. The ground below remained unseen, lost in a murky tapestry of clouds and shadow, but Cooper's focus did not waver. The descent was a private confrontation with fear, a silent reckoning with past injustices and present audacity. The storm whipped violently, yet he moved with grace, precise in every adjustment of his body, every tilt, every grasp of the briefcase. Inside the plane, the stewardess's hand shook uncontrollably, clutching the railing as she peered into the void. Did he survive? The pilot's voice was hoarse, scarcely audible above the wind. No one dared speak again. The silence that followed was thick, the memory of the leap imprinting itself on every mind aboard the aircraft.
And then he was gone. The darkness swallowed him, the rain hit him, and the night erased the man in black from sight. Only the briefcase remained, a symbol of calculated risk, of freedom seized, of the terrifying audacity of one man's will. The plane's cabin remained tense and silent, the storm outside a grim echo of the turbulence within. Cooper had vanished into legend, leaving behind witnesses forever marked by the audacity they had seen, the fear they had felt, and the man who had transformed desperation into a carefully orchestrated flight into darkness. The night swallowed Cooper, leaving nothing but rain-lashed clouds and the distant hum of engines. Flight 305 returned to Seattle, its passengers and crew physically safe but emotionally fractured, their minds haunted by the audacity of what they had witnessed. The stewardess clutched her hands together, staring blankly at the tarmac as if expecting him to emerge from the darkness. The pilot remained in the cockpit, knuckles white on the controls, a quiet tremor running through his body. The man in black had vanished, yet his
presence lingered like smoke in every mind aboard. On the ground, the federal agent who had boarded the flight was already consumed. His eyes, dark with obsession, scanned every detail, the tracks on the wet tarmac, the faint disturbance of puddles, the distant lights of the city beyond. He replayed the jump repeatedly in his mind, the precision, the calm, the invisibility of Cooper's movements. The weight of the case pressed on him, a relentless gravity pulling him into sleepless nights and quiet desperation. Cooper's disappearance was not just a physical absence, it was a psychological wound, a puzzle he could not stop turning over in his mind. Local law enforcement mobilized quickly, their radios crackling with coordination. Officers combed the surrounding forests and hills, flashlights cutting swaths through fog and darkness. Helicopters circled overhead, spotlights swinging in wide arcs, but the terrain swallowed their beams. Every gust of wind, every ripple in the trees, seemed to suggest movement that was never there. The agents and officers were meticulous, organized, but Cooper had already disappeared beyond the reach of conventional methods. A journalist arrived on the scene, notebook in hand, skeptical yet insistent. She spoke to the crew, capturing fragments of terror and awe, writing the story even as it unfolded before her. "You're telling me he just vanished?" she asked, voice laced with disbelief. The stewardess nodded numbly, eyes wide. He just leapt into the storm and was gone," she whispered. Her words were both explanation and confession, a trembling acknowledgement of the impossible. The pilot only shook his head, staring at the clouds, as though trying to will Cooper back into view. Whispers of sightings began almost immediately. A fisherman reported a dark figure on a distant ridge, a shadow moving too deliberately to be natural. A trucker on Highway 101 claimed to glimpse a lone man walking along the fogged shoreline, briefcase in hand. Each sighting fueled speculation, obsession, and fear, blurring the line between reality and legend. Cooper's disappearance had transformed him from a criminal into a myth, a phantom whose presence was felt even in absence. Back at headquarters, the federal agent pored over maps, timelines, and weather patterns. He noted every detail of the drop, every possibility of concealment. His obsession deepened with every passing hour. Sleep became a luxury, the line between duty and compulsion fading. Cooper's calm, methodical execution of the plan haunted him, the psychological mastery overshadowing every rational assessment. He was determined to find him, to close the gap between myth and man, but the shadows of uncertainty stretched endlessly before him. Meanwhile, the crew members struggled to reconcile their relief with lingering fear. Each glance at the empty cabin, each creak of metal, reminded them that they had been part of something extraordinary and terrifying. The stewardess often found herself replaying Cooper's quiet words, his subtle manipulations, the faint smile that conveyed both reassurance and threat. Even in his absence, he controlled the narrative, the emotional gravity, and the memory of terror. Night bled into dawn, the Pacific Northwest shrouded in mist and uncertainty. Cooper had vanished, leaving only echoes of fear, fascination, and obsessive pursuit. The pilot and stewardess knew that they were marked forever, their routines haunted by one night when the ordinary collided with the extraordinary. The agent remained vigilant, local law enforcement continued their search, and the journalists scribbled furiously, capturing fragments of myth before reality could settle. Somewhere beyond the clouds, beyond the forests and rivers, Cooper moved silently, a shadow in motion, his briefcase full of freedom and secrets. The world below would never forget the man in black, the audacity of the jump, or the vanishing act that had left everyone who witnessed it suspended in awe, terror, and obsession.
Years passed, and the legend of D.B. Cooper grew in whispers, headlines, and half-remembered rumors. Fragments of evidence appeared sporadically: a torn parachute snagged in a tree far from the drop zone, a briefcase-like bag found abandoned along a muddy riverside, faint footprints in unexpected locations. Each discovery was tantalizing, yet inconclusive, a breadcrumb trail that led to more questions than answers. The federal agent, now older, thinner, consumed, treated each fragment as if it were a lifeline, proof that the man in black still existed somewhere beyond the reach of law, time, and reason. In the quiet of his dimly lit office, he spread photographs, maps, and witness statements across the desk. Red string connected points, lines, and dates, a chaotic lattice of obsession and strategy. He muttered to himself, tracing paths in the air with trembling fingers. "It has to be here, somewhere," he whispered, voice raw from
sleepless nights and years of unrelenting pursuit. Colleagues who had once respected him now watched from a distance, unsure whether admiration or pity dominated their gaze. His obsession had become a moral quagmire. He lied to superiors, bypassed protocol, and manipulated witnesses, all in the service of a man who had vanished decades ago. Nights were spent re-examining old interviews, probing inconsistencies, convincing himself that every discrepancy was a clue, every misdirection a trap to be unraveled. He was no longer tracking Cooper as a criminal. He was chasing a ghost born of his own compulsions. "You're putting everyone at risk," one colleague finally shouted, slamming a folder onto the desk. The sound echoed through the sterile office, papers trembling in the sudden burst of anger. "This isn't about finding him anymore. It's about you. You're obsessed." The agent's head lifted slowly, eyes burning with intensity. "Obsession is what keeps us alive in this game," he said, voice low but sharp, each word precise. "Without it, we fail. We let him slip through our fingers. Do you understand? I will not let this end unfinished." "Unfinished?" another colleague snapped, voice rising. "You've jeopardized credibility, broken trust with the department, and ignored every protocol we've ever enforced. There are rules you've abandoned for your personal vendetta." The agent leaned forward, hands pressed to the desk, veins prominent. "Vengeance? No. Justice, mastery, understanding. Cooper isn't just a criminal. He's a test, and I will not fail it." The silence that followed was almost deafening, a charged vacuum where morality and obsession collided. Outside the office, news reports occasionally surfaced, sightings, old stories revisited, cryptic messages and letters sent to local newspapers. Cooper's legend had permeated the culture, the myth growing larger than the man, fueled by the cracks left in human memory and attention. The agent consumed every report, cross-referencing every detail with files he kept in meticulous secrecy. Some nights, he dreamed of the man in black, parachuting silently across dense forests, watching the agent's own life unravel with a detached amusement. The moral ambiguity of his pursuit deepened. Lies told to colleagues, manipulated witnesses, falsified reports, all were rationalized by necessity. Yet in quiet moments, he wondered if the pursuit had corrupted him, transformed him into something indistinguishable from the man he sought. The line between hunter and hunted blurred. Obsession became an echo, reverberating louder than reason, morality, or empathy. And yet fragments persisted: a scrap of a parachute, a witness claiming to see a shadow in the trees, a faded photograph of a figure walking in the rain. Each hint renewed his fervor. Each clue pulled him deeper into a psychological labyrinth of fear, hope, and compulsion. Cooper was gone, yet he remained omnipresent in the agent's mind, shaping decisions, controlling emotions, testing boundaries decades after vanishing into legend. The years had transformed the chase into something unrecognizable, less about the crime itself and more about the obsession it had spawned. And as the agent stared at the web of connections sprawling across his walls, he understood a quiet, terrible truth. To follow Cooper was to follow a ghost that mirrored the darkest corridors of his own mind. The line between pursuit and surrender had vanished. He was trapped in the clues, in the lies, in the shadow of a man who might never have existed outside the obsessions of those he left behind. Decades had passed, yet the shadow of D.B. Cooper lingered, stretching far beyond the rain-soaked tarmac and misty forests of the Pacific Northwest. The legend had grown, blending fact, rumor, and imagination into a spectral presence that haunted not just the federal agents who had chased him, but anyone who had glimpsed his calm, calculating audacity.
In the quiet of their lives, memories returned unbidden. The roar of the engines, the hiss of wind through the cabin, the flash of the black briefcase in the night. Cooper's absence had left more than questions. It had left scars. The federal agent who had devoted decades to tracking him moved cautiously now, older, thinner, his hair streaked with gray, hands trembling as he sorted through brittle files and faded photographs. He had become a ghost of himself, obsessed with a man who may never have existed outside his own compulsions. Every fragment of evidence, every whispered sighting, every unexplained clue carried the weight of decades, and he had followed them all relentlessly. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought dreams of that stormy night, of the leap into darkness, and of the man who had disappeared into myth. A civilian witness, long overlooked, had recently come forward, a retired logger named Harold, whose memory was etched with a single vivid image. One rainy November evening,
Decades ago, he had glimpsed a man stumbling from the trees along the Columbia River, briefcase in hand, soaked to the bone, yet moving with deliberate precision. At the time, Harold had dismissed it as imagination, fear, or the quirks of an isolated, storm-beaten night. Now he remembered clearly, and the recollection carried a weight he could not ignore. Harold's recollection came during a quiet meeting with the federal agent. I saw him, he admitted, voice low, as if speaking it aloud might make it vanish again. Near the river. He was moving fast, but not panicked. It was like he had planned every step. I didn't tell anyone because I thought I was imagining it. The agent leaned forward, eyes narrowing, fingers tapping the table with impatience and desperation. You're certain? His voice was low, hoarse with years of obsession. The details, every movement. Could you swear to it? Harold swallowed, hesitation and fear mingling. I think so. I remember the briefcase, the way he moved. There was a kind of control, even in chaos, like nothing could touch him. The room fell into silence. Outside, the Pacific Northwest wind rattled the window panes, carrying a faint chill, as though the storm itself had followed them across the decades. In that moment, the agent felt both hope and despair, the possibility of a breakthrough mixed with the stark realization that he may never truly close the chapter, that Cooper's mastery had become a permanent, haunting presence in his life. Regret threaded through the conversation, unspoken yet palpable. Years spent chasing shadows, bending rules, and sacrificing relationships weighed heavily on him. Harold, too, felt the lingering unease, the guilt of silence, the subtle knowledge that a single word at the right time could have changed the course of history, or perhaps only added to the myth. Obsession hung between them, thick as fog, a quiet reminder of the toll of unresolved events. Cooper had disappeared physically, yet psychologically, emotionally, and culturally he remained omnipresent. His legend persisted in whispers, in media recountings, in cold, empty flights, and in the haunted faces of those who had pursued him or witnessed his audacity firsthand. The agent finally exhaled, leaning back, head tilted toward the ceiling, eyes distant. Some people never truly vanish, he murmured, voice barely audible. They linger, in our memories, in our failures, in the spaces where fear and wonder collide. Harold noted, understanding the weight of years, of secrets, of obsession that neither time nor distance could erase. Outside, the clouds rolled endlessly over the forests and rivers, gray and infinite, as if the Pacific Northwest itself held its breath, remembering the stormy night when a man in black had leaped into darkness, leaving behind fear, fascination, and a haunting legend that would never fade. Decades after the night Flight 305 vanished into legend, the story of D.B. Cooper persisted, not just in headlines, newsreels, and court records, but in the minds of those who had witnessed the audacity firsthand. The plane's passengers, now older, carried the memory like a shadow stitched to their lives. The stewardess often awoke in the quiet hours, heart hammering at the memory of wind, rain, and the calm, unblinking eyes of the man in black. The pilot, too, felt the echo of that night every time he gripped a yoke, the hum of an engine conjuring the invisible weight of a decision he could never undo. The federal agent, older, grayer, yet still haunted, revisited his meticulous files, each photograph and map a fragment of obsession that had defined his career and shaped his life. The chase had become more than a pursuit of a criminal. It was a confrontation with his own compulsion, a psychological crucible that revealed the fragility of morality under the pressure of obsession. Cooper's vanishing had turned pursuit into self-reflection, justice into moral ambiguity. Every lead, every fragment of evidence, every whispered rumor had reinforced both the brilliance of the man in black and the personal costs of chasing him. Observers outside law enforcement, the civilian witnesses, journalists, and historians grappled with the same questions. Harold, the retired logger, often replayed the image of the man with the briefcase, moving with deliberate precision along the riverside. Each memory carried both clarity and doubt, a reminder of a world partially observed, partially imagined. The weight of uncertainty lingered like a fog, obscuring answers while sharpening fascination.
The legend itself had become a mirror. For some, Cooper represented freedom at the edge of societal constraints, the ultimate act of audacity in a world constrained by rules, law, and expectation. For others, he symbolized the consequences of moral compromise, the terror imposed on innocent lives, the obsession he ignited in those who pursued him, and the internal
psychological cost of a crime that refused resolution. The lines between heroism, villainy, and myth blurred, leaving only questions suspended in time. In reflective moments, the stewardess spoke quietly to the pilot, decades after the event, still haunted. "We were part of something unimaginable," she said. "Even after all these years, it doesn't feel real." The pilot nodded slowly, voice subdued. "Real or not, it changed us. Control, fear, survival. It's more than just what happened in the air. It's what lingered after." The federal agent, sitting in his dimly lit office, acknowledged the same truth in his own way. Justice had been sought, plans executed, and clues followed, but the man who had orchestrated the night remained absent, free from the reach of law and certainty. Obsession had driven some to brilliance, others to sleepless nights and fractured relationships. Cooper had left a trail not just of money or notes, but of enduring questions about morality, control, and human desire. Even the fragments of evidence, faded photographs, rumored sightings, and the occasional scrap of parachute served as reminders that the story was unresolved. Each person touched by the events carried a private understanding that the pursuit of truth exacted a cost, that freedom could be claimed in audacious moments, and that the human mind was vulnerable to both fear and fascination. And then there was Cooper himself, forever absent, forever a ghost. His fate, as it had been for decades, remained unknown. He might have vanished into the forests, rivers, or mountains, or perhaps he lived in the margins of society, a shadow among shadows, untouched, unaccountable, yet eternally influential. His legacy was not just in the stolen money, the daring jump, or the headlines. It was in the psychological and emotional ripples he left behind, in the lives altered and obsessions ignited. As the years stretched into decades, one truth became undeniable. D.B. Cooper had transcended the act itself. He was no longer merely a skyjacker. He was an enduring symbol of audacity, mystery, and moral complexity. For those who had faced him, for those who had chased him, and for those who remembered him only in story, Cooper's presence lingered. The questions remained. The answers did not. And in that absence, the legend thrived.